You know, I often ask my question this to myself every day I come to church. I'm going to be honest with you. The question is, what's for lunch? Right? I wonder how many of you, if I asked you, if you've asked this question yourself, would raise your hand. I have. Right? We've all wondered it before. And whether we said it to ourselves as we came into this building, or during worship, or during the sermon, we've asked this question before. And Eli, I'm sorry, I got to confess to you, I'm going to probably ask that question once again at some point in a sermon. So I just want to confess that to you real quick. But you know, food is very important to us. It seems like whatever we do in our life, you know, it always revolves around food. You know, whether it be the holidays, you know, we're talking about food. Food matters a lot in our holidays. And it matters even for the holidays that's not even really about food. And I'm not talking about Christmas dinner. I'm talking about Valentine's Day. You know, if I don't take my wife to Cheesecake Factory every Valentine's Day, I'm basically on death row, you know? And speaking of death row, what else is important, right? That last meal that you have right before you die. It's like everything revolves around food. And, you know, and speaking of my wife, what was one of the first things I did with my wife when I first met her? I took her out to eat. It's like we can't avoid food. It's in every aspect of our life. You know, and we have graduation dinners, we have birthday dinners, we have coffee dates, summer cookouts, we award people with food, we have pizza parties for kids at school. It's just, we have entire industries related to food. And, you know, we just never seem to be quiet about it either. We don't stop talking about food. You know, how many times have you been at work and you meet someone new to work, and one of the first things you talk about is, what do you like to eat? And I can't tell you how many times I've debated with people that I barely know about, you know, if Chick-fil-A is the best fast food restaurant there ever was. You know, I've talked about that plenty. You know how many times I've talked about religion? Very, very, very little, to be honest with you. But I can certainly talk about that. But, you know, going back to how we never stop talking about food, and, you know, I'm not really proud of this, but there are times where I was having a lovely family dinner, you know, that we cooked ourselves. We were sitting at the family dinner table, and as we were sitting at the family dinner table, we were watching a show about food, and guess what we were talking at the table? We were talking about what we're going to have tomorrow. Seems a bit much. And, you know, that's a shame. That really is a shame, because for some people, eating at the family dinner table is one of the very few times you ever really get to connect with each other. You know, for a lot of kids who have parents who work full time, that may be the only time they have to connect with their parents. And that's a sad thing, and we have to make the most out of that. But, you know, when I think about how often food is involved in our lives, I always think about, what does Scripture really talk about when it comes to food? And one of the things I was researching is how often food is talked about in the Bible. And, you know, depending on your translation, it will change. But when I was looking it up, you know, food is broadly mentioned roughly around 1,200 times plus, when compared to love, roughly around anywhere between 600 and 800 times. Not that I'm saying that food is more important than love, but it's kind of interesting to me that we would talk about food so much even in the Bible. And it's constantly referenced. You know, John 6, verse 35, Jesus said to them, "I'm the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger." Matthew 4:4, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." 1 Peter 2:2, "Like new infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up in the salvation." Revelation 19:9, "Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb." And you know what? Eating is what got us here in the first place, right? Adam and Eve looking at you. What did they do? They ate something that they weren't supposed to. No matter where you look, it kind of leads back to food. And I think back, how does, you know, when we think in church, what is for lunch? What am I going to eat? We're having a meal in church. And we are eating something in church, and yet I'm thinking about a meal outside of church. Why is that? Why do I do that? And I think it's because we often forget that Jesus is our food. He is our spiritual food that we have to have in order to survive. We are starving for food, but not food of our stomach, but food in our hearts. John 6:53, then Jesus said to them, most assuredly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. This meal is food, and it is chicken soup for the soul. And if we don't eat it, we are dying of starvation in our hearts. And when we think of this meal, the scripture, the food that we eat, Jesus, he is what sustains us. And he is the food that we truly need. So going back to the question I asked originally, when you ask yourself, what's for lunch? I want you to think about, I implore you to think about the question that I think matters far more, is what is for lunch for my soul?